I think that the really sort of great creators are the ones that, are confident and know that if 5 ideas get killed, they're happy and confident enough to kind of show up the next day or the next week with 5 more. That's what I really mean by resiliency. Being able to sort of, as you kind of get a little more mature and a bit more experience, it's shaking off the disappointment of, that idea that you love and you fell in love with, and shaking off the death, if you will, of that idea and moving on and creating more and falling in love again,
Cedric is the Chief Creative Officer at Big Spaceship, a New York-based independent agency with a client list that includes JetBlue, Starbucks, and Google. Cedric is an industry veteran whose accolades include helming MRY as Social Media Agency of the Year and also founding the U.S. Air Guitar Championships. In this episode, we talk about the importance of resiliency as a creative thinker, finding the magic in the room through reduction, and the necessity of fusing brand and product. Welcome to our show, Cedric.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here. Very exciting to chat with you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Looking forward to it. And so I always like to start off just learning a quick background about you, your childhood, where you came from, and what you wanted to be when you grew up.
Yeah. I grew up in Dublin in the 70s and, moved to America somewhere like, I don't know, like 1994, I think it was. So, I grew up in Dublin, went to school there, went to college there, and then, ended up getting a green card. Sort of fortunately, got a green card, was able to get out of Dublin and come to New York, and, ended up in advertising, sort of by, happenstance a little bit. And here I am.
Looking back, on your earlier years, whether that was before college or after college, like when did you realize you were a creative person or know that you wanted to be in a creative career?
I don't know that there was any real moment that I realized that I wanted to be a creative person per se. I think that like in my kind of experience of sort of growing up, I went to a boarding school down in Limerick, in the sort of down the kind of west of Ireland, and it was run by Benedictine monks. It was a very sort of strange place. And one of the kind of things that you sort of realize in boarding school is that to sort of survive, you have to kind of figure out how to, operate in sort of groups of people. You're never really alone. I was sort of in boarding school sort of 8 weeks at a time, and then I got to go back to Dublin. But in that process, I think, looking back and realizing sort of the culture, sort of agencies, and understanding how to kind of operate within an agency environment is very similar to sort of, being in boarding school. You're constantly around a lot of people. You have to kind of figure out how to kind of handle yourself in sort of conference rooms. How do you get sort of people to listen to you, or if you have an idea, how do you kind of pitch that idea? So I think that was one of the things that probably allowed me to succeed in some ways in an advertising kind of agency environment. Maybe, and that was sort of probably at the beginning. I mean, I think the world of sort of the agency life has changed, and obviously, since COVID and we're all remote, that's kind of changed a lot ever since. I'm not sure we'll ever go back to that, but I think that was sort of, one of the ways that I started to be able to kind of figure out who I was. And then I was able to, I spent a lot of time kind of doing debating in school. And I think maybe that was, another sort of skill that I sort of brought forward into kind of my advertising career.
And so it sounds like you really learned how to sell an idea through these experiences.
Yeah, I think that's it. I wasn't, I sort of have a copywriter background. I liked telling stories. I think sort of growing up in Ireland, you sort of learn that kind of gift of the gab of how to tell a story and how to kind of command people's sort of attention. And sort of what the arc of a story is, and what a punchline is, and that kind of thing. I used to kind of write a good bit, but never with a view to sort of ending up in a pursuing a creative career. That was not something that I really thought I could do, or really understood that was even possible. It wasn't until I sort of came to America and that I sort of started to sort of dip my toe in the advertising world. And then I sort of, once I got into it, I realized, oh, wow, I really love this. And, never sort of looked back, you know.
Yeah.
Once I got to America, I wasn't quite sure, what I wanted to do. I arrived in America with a sort of a history degree from Trinity College. And, you know, in retrospect, I kind of think that that was a really smart and great degree to have in lieu of having a degree in fine art or in communications or anything like that, because I think that sort of gives you perspective on the world and you start to sort of see those sort of repeatable structures. But I arrived in New York and really didn't quite know what I wanted to do. I actually ended up as working as a doorman on the Upper East Side, and actually then subsequently on the Upper West Side. That was sort of an interesting sort of entree into New York. I like to joke that it was like an entry level position. But I sat around all day just sort of reading books and giving people their packages or their dry cleaning, that kind of thing. And then one day, one of the tenants in the building was sort of was friends with somebody who owned a temp agency, and I sort of figured, okay, maybe I'll do a temp job, whatever. And I ended up at Gray Advertising, answering the phone for a newly minted executive creative director there, a guy called Mark Schwatka, who over the course of sort of 3 to 6 months was sort of realized, all right, you can't just sit there. And he started to give me sort of radio briefs and things of that nature to write. And so he really taught me how to kind of write copy. I would go in and sort of show him these radio scripts, and he would sort of cut the top off and say, I'm assuming, you should start here. And he was usually right. And, definitely he was old school in his way of advertising and thinking about advertising, was that sort of old sort of Bates unique selling proposition. And through him and through that, I kind of really learned how to write copy and write advertising.
It's a pretty crazy story. Immigrant, doorman, temp agency, and then cracked into the ad world without ever expecting to. Looking back, does that path seem a little bit crazy to you of how you ended up where you are now?
Not really. I mean, I think, I guess in the context of today, where a lot of people are sort of, almost exclusively folks are coming in through on the creative side anyway, coming in through kind of art schools, and they go to Miami Art School or Ad School or SVA or one of these kinds of places, which is great. People have these really polished portfolios. I never really had a portfolio. It was kind of sort of weird to say that. I mean, as like a decade or so later, I had an online book, but never something as polished as you're sort of seeing coming out of art schools today. So yeah, definitely a different way of doing it, but I think that was sort of how people did it.
So how did you work your way up the ranks and, eventually get into this creative director role that you currently are in now?
Yeah, I think that the big moment for me was sort of realizing that, Gray wasn't the place for any real young creative at that time. It obviously kind of evolved and changed many years later under kind of Tide, Montague, and folks like that. But back then I remember talking to a recruiter, and they were sort of saying, look, I can get you out of jail, but I can't get you out of Gray. Gray people are going to hate me for saying that. But, what I did, I ended up sort of jumping and sort of switching over to digital, and that was sort of I guess it was 2000. Like that was a kind of a big move. I got a job at Tribal DDB or DDB Digital at the time, and it was kind of a crazy time. That kind of .com thing. People were sort of still sort of building websites and driving people to websites and through these sort of really fun, immersive sort of Flash-based experiences and things like that. So, I did that for about 9 years, actually, kind of quite a long time, sort of through the kind of the heyday of Tribal DDB, sort of becoming kind of agency of the year and sort of winning a lot of awards and all that kind of stuff. So that was great. And part of that, and during that kind of experience, I ended up sort of becoming a creative director, and just sort of trying to kind of figure it out, and managing teams and managing people and selling work and new business and all the rest of it. But it was very different, to back then. I sort of feel like we were having fun, and we would sit around and have ideas, and then we would sort of make a presentation and we'd sell the idea, and then we'd make it. And now, things are very different. You just sort of you got to make a lot more decks, and there's the landscape has become fragmented and complex, and there's a lot more sort of approval processes. Organizations are sort of that much more matrix, so it's pretty tricky. But back then, I think it was a little easier, to be honest.
That's interesting to hear, because you think, nowadays, like, these brands need to produce so much content and so many things, but you think it's actually more difficult now than it was back then in the early days of the web to sell these ideas and get them through.
I think people were they were less fearful, of sort of making things, and they just sort of, I think things are just way more scrutinized now, where the sort of chain of command, and as you are looking to create something, and then subsequently sort of spending a lot of money with media to sort of put behind it, things are just a lot more scrutinized, and people are paying a lot more attention, and that process, comes with many more hours of many more rounds of revisions and so on. So, yeah, I do think it's considerably harder, or it feels harder to me,
Yeah.
and it feels like it's a more laborious process. And I think that the game's kind of changed from trying to come up with a great idea and just making that, to now it's about sort of coming up with a great idea and nurturing that idea and sort of protecting that idea from sabotage. um, but things are complicated, in every aspect of the world these days, right?
Yeah. And what do you think has driven that change? Like, do you think it's just because there is so much data out there and analytics, and these brands have gotten more sophisticated in terms of measuring these campaigns, so everything just has a microscope over it at all times, or is it something else?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think, performance is a big part of it. We are looking, at the work, and we are sort of testing it so much more now. And, we have sort of a pretty good idea of, how the work is going to perform, and we know what the metrics are. So, yeah, that sort of complicates things. And, there aren't that many surprises in some ways, right? Uh, or you're more surprised when it doesn't work.
Yeah. On that note, would love to hear your philosophy on resiliency in the creative process, and maybe any tips or advice you have to other creative directors out there in getting your idea created in this new world.
Yeah. I think, I've sort of talked a little bit about resiliency before, and, that's sort of, I've always sort of felt like that's a real key tenet, and something I sort of look for in creatives is their sort of ability to kind of get back up. I mean, it sort of goes back to, this idea of sort of making, you know, decks and decks and rounds before you can actually sell an idea. But I think that, the really sort of great creators are the ones that, are confident and know that, if five ideas get killed, they're they're happy and confident enough to kind of show up the next day or the next week with five more. And that's what I really mean by resiliency. Being able to sort of, as you kind of get a little more mature and a bit more experience, it's like it's shaking off the disappointment of, that idea that you love and you fell in love with, and sort of shaking off you know the death, if you will, of that idea, and moving on and creating more and falling in love again.
Yeah.
And I think that's yeah, that's what resiliency is about. And I don't think I think it's not about sort of like holding on to things and trying to kind of revive them, and seeing if they can live in another way. I think you just have to let go. and, start again. And I think most of the time we're always sort of happy we did that. And, if you look back at all those sort of older presentations, you go, oh my, you'll see the journey that you've been on to sort of get to that kind of the better outcome.
Yeah. Having a short memory almost to let those kill your darlings, right?
Yeah, like goldfish.
And do you have any stories of, a time when this sort of resilience worked out for you and helped you achieve success?
I don't know that anything really super specific. I think that it's more, working on bigger kind of global campaigns is often the case. I certainly remember sort of doing Olympics work with Coca-Cola for a number of years, and that was it. You just sort of had to kind of, stay the course and, build those ideas and sort of sell them up through the kind of the food chain. And very often you get to the top 3 months later and then it gets killed and then you're back going again. But, at the end of the day, the Olympics doesn't move and it happens and you end up with something, something great. And, it's like, you got to just keep your eye on that. The clock does run down and you do get to kind of make the work.
Yeah. And so you worked at LBI. After that, you moved on to become Chief Creative Officer at MRY, which won Social Media Agency of the Year. Looking back on that time, what did you do at MRY that was innovative or game changing in the social realm?
Yeah, gosh, it's so long ago. My goldfish memory. I think back then we were sort of shifting from the sort of the idea of sort of always on and organic social to something a bit more robust. It was sort of in and around the time where social was kind of evolving. It was moving from being a kind of a unpaid media to something that, Facebook changed it up and said, okay, you want to post on Facebook, you got to put media behind it. And in doing so, the relationships kind of changed. And we started to shift into thinking, a little bit more about, the work through the lens of sort of advertising and marketing and versus away from, sort of that organic social work. And in doing so, I think we started to think a lot about data and testing and thinking about, what was really going to work, what was going to be shared, what were the conversations that were going to be pushed around this stuff. And then at the same time, we had in the creation of sort of MRY, we had merged Mr. Youth with LBI. So you had a kind of sort of a brand meets product kind of sensibility. And that was another kind of piece of the puzzle where you were sort of bringing some of that product thinking into kind of that social space. And it's something that we do think about a lot today at Big Spaceship, where we divvy up sort of the business and think about what that kind of a modern brand is today through the lens of sort of stories, systems, and communities. So, you've got those sort of big brand stories, you've got sort of the product work, and then you've kind of got, okay, well, if you're going to build this thing or you're going to tell stories about it, it has to be pretty interconnected where sort of brand is product and product is brand, and then understand, how are people going to interpret this? What are they going to do with it in social? How will they share about it? How will they create stories around it? And so on. So I think it's all sort of fairly connected and sort of linear in my mind. It's on that journey of going from sort of LBI to MRY and then to Big Spaceship. I think the things that I learned in sort of building websites and to the lens of sort of campaigns and building immersive experiences, and then thinking about how they, people are shifting around sort of culture and communities, and then has sort of brought me to kind of a good space with Big Spaceship.
Yeah, and I'm super interested on that topic. I run a product company, being a technology entrepreneur, and I know you've talked about the importance of product thinking and how brand and product are fusing. Maybe you could take us through a little bit of your philosophy on that and what your outlook is on that.
Yeah, I think that in this day and age, it used to be that you could just sort of, put a campaign out there, and say these things about stuff. But, people sort of, they figured it out. They can see behind the curtain now, and, they can look, at your website. They can look at the app. Those things have to be sort of interconnected. And so I really do think that, when you sort of think about, a lot of those sort of brands out there that, we do a lot of work with sort of JetBlue, we do some work with Chase. And in both instances, and also sort of Starbucks, where, suddenly, these brands, especially like during COVID, where, Starbucks sort of, stopped sort of for a moment, stopped kind of selling coffee and then became very much about a technology company who was teaching people, well, if you wanted to get coffee, you had to do it through mobile ordering. And so suddenly they become a kind of a smart tech company. And it's not just about, a reward or an app that is, built around rewards, but it's, really about sort of like how can products sort of meet that customer where they are, through a really smart app experience. I think that's very true again around Chase, where, whilst we're doing a lot of work with making content for those guys, it's still at the heart of it, the window into that brand is through that Chase mobile app. So those things are sort of interconnected.
Got it. So when you're talking about product and brand fusing, you're talking about taking the traditional campaign, commercial or whatever sort of marketing and advertising assets you would create, but fusing that with an actual like digital product experience that it connects with the customer and gives them a portal into the brand. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. I think that, at a very sort of basic level, when you look at sort of Nike, they've done, a pretty good job of that with, Nike ID and Run Club and all those kinds of things where, they sort of created these kind of new behaviors through those app experiences that sort of connected back to, the bigger stories that they were trying to tell around the brand. So I think, more and more brands are sort of beginning to see that. And, when they have a product that can sit at the heart of their brand, those things have to be sort of interconnected and intertwined. And to not do that is probably sort of missing a trick.
That's true, and of course, now Nike's getting into NFTs. They just acquired that NFT company, and it's strange to think you can almost think about Nike as much of a tech company as they are a shoe company, in a weird sense.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's absolutely been the case for a while, probably with Nike. You know, going back to sort of thinking about Fuel Band and those types of things, for sure.
What do you think the future of this looks like? Like, where do we go from here in 10 years? Any technology that you're excited about that you think will really impact this industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think I get very excited about technology. I think people are sort of, obviously AI and ChatGPT is, super topical at the moment. A lot of people say, "Oh, wow, this is," as a writer, that's sort of, a lot of people are sort of, quite nervous about that kind of thing, or, will all brands have the same tone of voice or something like that? I don't think so. I think it's gonna be really exciting. I love the idea that with, something like ChatGPT, you never start with a blank page anymore. You're going to start from a different place, and creativity might be about sort of, what are the prompts you write, or how well an editor you are, or I think it's pretty exciting. I heard somebody kind of drawing the parallel to, like, imagining, what it must have been like to write with, a quill. That must have been pretty tedious. And sort of then, along came the pencil. So, I think that it's just about the tools. The tools are sort of getting better. They're allowing us to move faster, probably, and hopefully, take a lot of the friction out of creation and creativity, that we can just sort of, concentrate back on sort of what those ideas are, and so on.
Yeah, it's a super exciting space. Although I can say that from using ChatGPT and these tools enough, I feel that I can spot it now. I was scrolling through LinkedIn the other day, and somebody wrote this long LinkedIn post, and I could just see that it was written by ChatGPT. Have you felt that way?
I definitely I haven't played around with it exhaustively, but it does have sort of a tone of voice that gives you kind of a vanilla kind of flavor. But I think
Yeah.
it'll evolve and it'll get better. And I think as you're able to give it different prompts, I think it's fun to say, okay, well, try it, with a bit of wit, add a bit of this flavor, add a bit of that. It's going to be, we're all going to become kind of like chefs where we're sort of adding, a little cumin and some flavor and see what happens. I don't know. I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be really interesting.
Yeah.
I think it's going to be interesting as well when you look at, the beyond just the sort of writing. I think just, how it can help customer service, how, you can get to better answers in searches and all that kind of stuff.
Definitely. Definitely.
I think I mean, suffice to say, we've only really sort of tipped, it's like the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I agree 100%. And I think that there's a lot of interesting places it can go. I think that potentially brands may train their own AI, their own model based on their own internal tone of voice or their own way that they look and feel, and that becomes a proprietary piece of technology that is unique to just that brand and can help them generate content and ideas that are unique to that brand. So yeah, I think especially the iterative process and the training of these models and everything is going to get really interesting over the next few years.
Yeah, no, it'll be fascinating, but I just, I think at the end of the day, like you said, you'll be able to spot it. There'll be different sort of fail safes sort of introduced, in the same way that sort of, colleges are able to kind of spot plagiarism, so, can't wait to see where it goes.
And so tell us about Big Spaceship. First of all, what made you excited about this company and made you want to join the team? And just tell us what's unique about the company.
I think, without getting, too sally about the agency, I think you know, the thing that I love about Big Spaceship and the thing that, immediately attracted me to the place is first of all, the culture of the place is really unique. For a long time, and to this day, really there's this sort of culture that everyone is creative, and there isn't, we've worked pretty hard to not have sort of departments and not have this sort of creative department that sits over there that is on the hook for the output of the agency. So we've done a lot of work over the years to try and make sure that everybody feels like they have a say in the creative output. And I think in doing so, that sort of changed the culture a lot, where people, feel like, the teams feel like they can support each other in very unique ways that are a little bit different to more kind of traditional agencies that are sort of set up in these sort of like heavier kind of silos of departments sitting in different places. So the team dynamic is very different as a result of having everybody sort of feel like they are, that creativity is a sort of a vocation in the agency. It's not something that's sort of written on your business card. Um, the second thing I think that is kind of interesting, um, and I think that makes us sort of uniquely different, is that we really look pretty closely. We do a really good job of looking at trends and culture, human behavior, and sort of cultural intelligence, and what those kind of innovations sort of mean. It's, I think the easiest thing to think about is like, when the iPhone kind of came along, we didn't sort of bolt on mobile, but we started to kind of think about sort of gestural design. We did a campaign a few years back for Converse where, it was sort of a back to school campaign where we were, supposed to kind of make this sort of a piece of content, a film, but we didn't. We created kind of a GIF library because we understood that, that target, that back then, whatever it was a few years ago, that was how kind of teens were expressing themselves. So we always like to kind of lean into culture, lean into frame. One of my favorite pieces recently was working. That was something that we did for NFL that we called Twitter confetti, which was a kind of it was it was an idea where you could write tweets of support for whatever team you were supporting in the Super Bowl. So the idea was that you would then that tweet of personal support would then be showered down on the players during the final whistle, and that was a kind of very kind of unique way of sort of taking a kind of a behavior that was happening on Twitter and sort of putting it into that physical space. And it was pretty successful, so much so that it's now a part of their kind of yearly piece of programming. So I love that stuff. I like the fact that we're able to kind of play in those kinds of spaces pretty consistently, but at the same time, not really worrying about the vehicle of the idea or what sort of media space it's going to occupy, and just sort of thinking about what would work well in culture, what would this sort of fan base look like, and why would they care?
Yeah, I love that. And going back to what you were talking about, where ideas can come from everywhere within the agency, I'd love to hear like what that means specifically, and how that functions in practice.
Yeah, I think we've got these sort of core values that we sort of stick to pretty pretty consistently, and one of those is this idea of speaking up, where when you get it's one of the things that I think that a lot of people sort of, when they join the agency, they're sort of like, oh wow, that's a little bit the calls are a little longer, the meetings are longer, because we try to create space for everybody and anybody to speak up and share their opinion. I think in doing so, you make sure that whatever those ideas are, or whatever somebody kind of speaks up and says what they want to say, or if they've got an idea or what have you, they feel very free to kind of be heard. And I like that, and I think that that's as creative directors, or those types of people in those rooms at those times, our job is to sort of kind of be that, to really listen very acutely, and the answers are usually there. You just got to kind of like cut through the noise and be able to kind of like pick it out of the air. I was just listening to an interview with Rick Rubin. He's just released his new book, where he describes himself as a reducer and not a producer. And I think, I love that, because, it reminds me a lot of sort of the role of kind of the creative director, if you will, who has to sort of, cut through the clutter of the noise of around an idea. And very often that is, people want to build and build and build on the idea, and it sort of becomes a little bit unrecognizable. And I think that when we allow people to speak up, there's a sort of you want to kind of build on those ideas, but you want to be able to kind of make sure that you've got the ideas being a little bit sort of protected at the same time. It's about kind of reduction and clearing the way for those ideas, ultimately.
But it takes a bit, what you described, everybody can speak up, everybody can contribute ideas. I think that as the creative director, you then have to have a little bit of a lack of ego, right? To be able to take all those ideas in and parse through them, rather than just saying, I'm the creative director, I have the best ideas in the room.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't know that there are super successful creative directors anymore who are sort of really truly believing that they're the ones who are kind of marching into the room with the big idea and that's it. I don't know that that's the way it works anymore. Sure, I'm sure it probably does, but it's not how I'm sort of seeing how things are sort of coming to bear anymore. That's not to say that people don't bring ideas into the room, and they should. And sometimes they're great, and that's it.
And so, getting off the agency track a little bit, I want to take some time to learn about one of your other ventures, which is really cool. But you actually co-founded the Air Guitar World Championships. Tell me what inspired you to start that and how that story unfolded.
Yeah, the U.S. Air Guitar Championships. That was a sort of an interesting chapter. Back in, I think, early 2000s or whatever it was. I was, pitching a lot of, reality TV shows, and I think, it was back when sort of like, hold on, let me just think for a second. Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah. The U.S. Air Guitar. Yeah. It was somewhere sort of back in the early 2000s. I was, and with a writing partner, we were pitching a lot of sort of reality TV shows. I think it was kind of on the back of American Idol, where we were sort of thinking about what a no talent search would look like, and we ended up with this idea of an air guitar competition, and then subsequently we sort of looked around online and we realized that there was a world air guitar championships that had been happening sort of for 4 or 5 years, but America had never competed. So it happened in Finland. We went to Finland and got the rights to host the American chapter of it, and we started. You know, we'd also sort of sold the idea to VH1 at the time. So, we had sort of, attached a kind of production company to the whole thing as well. And we ended up sort of, you know, launching this thing. And then subsequently VH1, canceled the idea. So we were left sort of, with this, air guitar competition. But, it immediately kind of took off. I think Howard Stern talked about it a lot in the build up to the finals. And, the thing sort of just took off from there and kind of sort of became its own little kind of cottage industry of fandom. And a lot of fun for many years. We actually ended up doing a documentary about it called Air Guitar Nation. That was a nationwide release. Was kind of cool, and very interesting time. I was still sort of working at Tribal DDB at the time, and it sort of it taught me a lot about kind of fandom and how people were responding to kind of these sort of pockets of culture, and how those things kind of suddenly kind of just explode into culture and become these sort of very tangible things out of nothing. So that's sort of no pun intended there.
I was curious to know like what you learned from that in terms of like community and culture, and if any of that influenced the creative decisions you make today.
I think in the making of the documentary, I certainly learned a lot about longer form editing and storytelling and that kind of thing, and that was great. As far as again, I think, like I said, just sort of going back, and we worked on YouTube for a long time, and it was very similar. Sort of thinking about what YouTube is to people. Like there's pockets of YouTube, no matter who you are or what you're into, there's a place on YouTube for you. And I think, and in some ways, sort of like air guitar is a sort of a microcosm of that. There's like all these sort of weird and wonderful people sort of showing up, who come from different walks of life, who just sort of wanted to get on stage and put themselves forward and just sort of forget who they are for 60 seconds and perform. And I think that's just sort of a interesting human behavior that I think has I always found sort of fascinating, and still do to this day. Why do people get on stage and do anything?
Yeah. Tell me about just learning about you personally. Would love to know like what is something that you are incredibly passionate about.
Yeah, I think I'm a huge sports fan. This is I love Premier League football. I obsess about that a lot of the time.
American football or classic football?
The English Premier League.
Got it. Who's your team?
I'm a Tottenham fan for my sins, long suffering. It's been a kind of it's like supporting the Jets, I think.
Got it. Very cool. Who were you rooting for in the World Cup?
I was I was definitely sort of rooting in for the finals. I think I was for sure rooting for Messi. I think most people were. I think, everybody was like, looking to kind of just settle the debate between Messi and Ronaldo once and for all. I think, that did it.
Mhm. Yeah, controversial opinion here on the podcast.
Yeah, I know.
But yeah, no, it was great to see Messi finally get his World Cup. I'm a Brazil fan, so we've got a bit of a rivalry there, but
Yeah,
still good to see.
yeah,
Good story.
absolutely.
And so looking back in your career, if you go back to the very beginning, I suppose when you first came to America, what advice would you give to your 20-year-old self looking back?
Probably, if I was to think about my 20s and, what I did, I probably just stayed in bed too much. I think life is short. Don't spend your weekends in bed. I wished I did more on the weekend. I wish I'd sort of not slept in as much.
Very prescient advice for young kids. I think that's so true. And I suppose as you get older, you probably look back at those younger years. I'm getting older myself, and I wish you had gotten more out of them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, listen, I've got kids now, and it's who are, beginning to get into their teen years, and which is great as a parent. Now I get to sleep in. So
Awesome.
these are all phases we go through, right?
Yeah. You earned it. You earned it. But yeah, well, great. Thank you for joining. Really enjoyed the conversation, and appreciate your time joining the podcast.
Thank you very much. It was wonderful talking with you.
You as well. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and comment to help us spread the word. You can also find more insider content on the Assemble blog, and you can find me on all channels at Nate Watkin. And don't forget, if your producing team is in need of a project management solution, try Assemble today to streamline your production workflow. Our listeners received their first month free by utilizing the code OFFSCRIPT, that's one word, at checkout. You have been listening to the Creatives Off Script podcast hosted by Assemble.